any time, at any time possible in this country. The people who lived in this country had to therefore develop a system that said they could survive this nutritional deprivation at any time, so that they are indeed very, very insulin resistant. If you look at across the ethnic minorities, across the board, Indians have one of the highest incidences of insulin resistance. And so in effect, you are geared to a very nutritionally deprived environment. What's happened in the last 50 years? In the last 50 years, especially in the cities, more so than in the rural India, there has been a tremendous overnutrition. Plus, we no longer walk, we drive. And so in effect what happened was what was once a tremendously protective element for you has now become the seat of some disease. Insulin resistance is where the muscle won't pick up all the glucose, you therefore leave some glucose behind, you shunt into fat. If you're limited in the amount of food you have, you don't put on a lot of fat. But if you're not, then in fact you're going to specifically lay down fat. Once you lay down fat, then fat signals back and says, enough, I don't need any more, and you see a down regulation of insulin receptor number and the affinity of those insulin receptors for insulin. So now you've got a problem. You can't put glucose into muscle, you're having difficulty putting glucose into fat. So the beta cell basically says, what do you want me to do with this? And does exactly what every one of you would do to me if I said, no speaking Hindi. If I said I didn't speak Hindi, and that's what you were most comfortable with, what would you do? You would talk Hindi, but talk louder. And that's what beta cell does. It says it's going to produce more insulin. So at the cost of a rising insulin, you will continue to maintain a normal glucose until such time as the beta cell can no longer keep up with its ability to compensate for insulin. And once the beta cells loses this compensatory reserve, you get diabetes. So insulin resistance is something that we need, but unfortunately it hasn't evolved with our environment, and beta cells are what we'd have to work with. So in a way I've gone through a lot of data right about now, and basically if you therefore look at what happens, the first and foremost is peripheral insulin resistance in muscle and in fat, and then hepatic insulin resistance, because after all, if we are going to starve, we need a constant supply of glucose. Because just because you're starving doesn't mean the heart stops or the kidney stops. And so in effect, the liver acts as a constant glucose infuser. And the way you control how much glucose comes out of the liver is by the amount of insulin there is. The higher the level of insulin, the more closed the gate is from the liver. Makes sense. You had breakfast. Right now, you don't want your liver to produce glucose, and so therefore, your insulin levels being high stops the glucose from being produced. As soon as you get out of here and you start jogging, you want to be able to make sure that you get enough glucose to run the muscles. You drop your insulin, you open the gate at the liver, and in fact, more glucose comes out and supplies the muscle. So in effect, the liver is exactly the opposite. And of course, there is pancreatic insulin secretion we just talked about. So, when you see an elevated fasting blood sugar, what does that really mean? When you see a blood sugar of 125, 180, 100 and whatever, what does that actually mean? What is it? It is really a risk prognosticator. For what? Is it for retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, or vasculopathy? If you could put in your answers, please. Oh, you don't have this question. I'm sorry. Well, basically, it is retinopathy. I think all of you know that in effect, these were the basis for making the diagnosis of 126. Basically, what it was that you were going to see whether you looked at the Pima Indians, the Egyptians, or the NHANES database. When you looked at when your doctors looked at this, looking after this database and said, at what level of fasting sugar do you see diabetic retinopathy? It turned out it didn't matter whether Egyptian, Pima Indian, or North American. At around about 120 to 124, you saw the incidence of diabetic retinopathy taking off. And so we decided if that is the occurrence of the structural abnormalities of diabetes, the earliest ones, we would therefore say that causes diabetes. And that's why we chose 126. If you were to use vasculopathy as being your turnoff, then in this particular study done in 1999, 100,000 patients, 95,000 patients, basically what they showed that for vasculopathy, at 2-hour postprandial, for every 1 milligram per deciliter over 110 milligrams per deciliter, you increase your vascular risk 2%. For every 1 milligram per deciliter over 75 milligrams per deciliter fasting, you increase your vascular risk 1%. Now, I'm not asking you to make a diagnosis of diabetes at 75. I'm just saying that if you use epidemiologic data, then in fact, the variation becomes completely different. Neuropathy occurs at 105, nephropathy becomes about 115. So when you use those data, you can't always make a diagnosis, but that's what we use anyway. This is another study looking at approximately 17,000 men over a 33-year period. Vasculopathic risk started off at 83 milligrams per deciliter. Again, not a place where you start making a diagnosis of diabetes, but it's important to note that you can see risk occurring. So, when you look at insulin resistance at target tissue, at muscle, it's mainly the inability to dispose of glucose. So your postprandial hyperglycemia is initially going to be driven by muscle resistance. On the other hand, fat, as fat becomes less sensitive to insulin, it releases free fatty acids into the circulation to try and, because as far as the body is concerned, if the insulin is not working, that's because the level is too low, not because they're resistant. You will release free fatty acids because that's your secondary fuel, and therefore that will drive insulin resistance. Liver, obviously, increase hepatic glucose output, and beta cell dysfunction, decrease insulin production. So, insulin resistance manifests in all of these tissues except adipose tissue, brain and CNS, beta cell, liver, and muscle tissue. Which one does not really have very much an effect from insulin resistance? If you could put in your answers, please. Okay. So, absolutely, of all the people who answered, everyone got the answer right. Obviously, it's the brain. The brain is not necessarily insensitive to insulin. Next. So, what causes an elevated fasting sugar? Well, what causes an elevated fasting sugar is almost completely related to hepatic glucose output. It doesn't matter how big a meal you had at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock last night. If you're more than 5 to 6 hours fasting, then that meal has been dealt with. Your final determinant is going to be how much glucose is going to come out of your liver. And how much glucose comes out of your liver is really a matter of hepatic insulin sensitivity and overnight insulin secretory capacity, together with glucagon. So, if your glucagon is very high and your insulin is very low, you will promote the greater production of glucose from the liver, and that will therefore cause an increase in fasting hyperglycemia. It's something that becomes very important to understand, that fasting hyperglycemia seems to have a different pathophysiology than postprandial, which is completely related to the ability of insulin to secrete in response to a glucose load and therefore limit the excursion that you see. So pathophysiologically, here you're seeing muscle insulin sensitivity, and it causes postprandial changes. So any self-respecting person giving a talk on diabetes must show this slide, otherwise you get shot for treason. And so basically what this slide purports to show is that when you look at insulin resistance in the lower panel, it is clearly present and persistent. Your body tries to overcome it by hypersecreting insulin. When the ability to secrete insulin falls off, when the ability to secrete insulin falls off, first your postprandial and then your fasting starts to go up. And we can decide when you decide got diabetes. We've decided it's at 126, but we could just be at any time that we feel like it. So, question 3. All the statements regarding insulin resistance are true, except The normal suppression of gluconeogenesis by insulin in the liver is impaired. The normal uptake of glucose by muscle is impaired. The normal glucose disposable in muscle by oxidation and glycogen synthesis is impaired. Excess free fatty acids impair beta cell function. The normal degradation of triglycerides to free fatty acids by adipose tissue is impaired. If you could put in your answer, please.